Welcome to another episode of the Trees and Lines podcast. Today we talked with Amy Newkirk, the Vegetation Manager for Solar Generation at Invenergy. We discussed the value of people and people skills, the regulatory environment they operate under, and Amy's unique opportunity to look at new approaches in veg management. Have a listen. Hope you enjoy. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you both. It's a real pleasure to be a guest on your podcast. And
Yeah, well, good.
I hope we have a good time talking about the UVM work that I'm doing at Invenergy.
Very much so. Amy and I have known each other for quite a few years now. It's been good working experience with you. And I know that you've had an unusual career in utility veg management, really diverse, unlike anyone I can think of. So would you tell us a little bit about your career track, and then maybe tell us a little bit about Invenergy, what you're doing now and what it does?
Yeah, okay, happy to. So I think I am similar to many people in UVM in that most of us don't plan to get here. We sort of arrive here through diverse roads. But mine, I started out, about 15 years of my professional career, I devoted to natural area management, as a forest ecologist coming out of NC State, and I was going to save the rainforest. And that was really rewarding work that I enjoyed for those 15 years. And over time, got to see a lot of different natural area communities. So I was excited about the opportunity to actually switch into UVM because one of my natural areas had a transmission line on it. And I got to know the folks that worked at that company. And as I learned more about, their aspirations for IVM and managing the rights of way for, multiple use benefits, that aligned really well with my environmental training. And so I took the leap. I said, what the heck, I'll give it a try. So went to work as a regional forester at a transmission owner operator in the Midwest. And that was at a time shortly after the Northeast blackout and the newly enforceable FAC 3 standards. But I loved it because of the sort of multifaceted approach we had to take, right? It was about the vegetation and about safety and reliability. But in the end, we worked so well together as a team that I learned, many formative lessons at that point, right? I was new to the industry. I needed to learn what we were trying to do, but I learned more importantly about the value of our team. So couldn't have done that work without the backup up and down. The management team, the crews that we had out in the field were outstanding. And anyway, that lesson about the people component has stayed with me through my whole career. So after some time doing that in the field, I went on to lead the program at that company, did that for a while. My next step was over into line clearance contracting and opening up a new territory for a small company. Again, learning tons about, what's behind that door. Always had a huge respect for the folks in the field. That's where it starts and ends, but learned even more about the challenges that they face and how they solve for those. Next, I went over to consulting. I think as a person who enjoys a new challenge, I'm always looking for what's around the corner there. And I felt I had accrued a lot of valuable skills and experiences that I could help other utilities in their vegetation management programs. And I did enjoy doing that. I hoped that I did solve for problems that they were facing. But along the way, I also was learning that there are many ways to execute kind of the same program, utility vegetation management. I joke that it's not really rocket science, but you have to be passionate about it, and you just really need to have a good plan and work the plan. And who works the plan, right? It's the people. So every company, every business model, they're doing it a little differently, even though their plans looked very similar. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And it's something that I brought to Invenergy when I got started working with them, understanding that, we can put together a utility scale program for the clean energy transition and the vegetation management at the renewable energy sites. But listen, it's it's going to look real similar to other vegetation management programs, and how Invenergy executes on that is going to be, very Invenergy centric. So what that company does, I'll take a step back and maybe describe Invenergy and the work that we're doing. 20 years old company or 20 years young, depending on your perspective of it. Over that time, the company has developed, built, and now has in operations over 200 projects around the world. So we have offices in North America, Central America, Europe, Asia, and we're really aiming, to continue influencing the clean energy transmission across the globe.
You're the owner operator of all of those assets?
A combination. Good question, Tej. The Invenergy does develop, build, and then retain, own, and operate many of its projects. Some of those projects they develop, build, and then sell to another asset owner.
Yeah.
But interestingly, we almost always continue to operate and maintain those facilities.
Got
So, the expertise that we've developed in doing the O&M part sort of sticks with those projects, whether we built them or pass them on to somebody else, or increasingly we're recognized as being able to bring those O&M skill sets to projects that other companies develop and own.
Interesting. Go ahead, Phil.
No, I was just going to, tell us a little bit. Veg Management for purposes of the generation sites and the transmission, but I'll bet it looks different than what you saw at the electric utilities, other utilities.
Well, it's different because nobody's done it before. So I talked about, the fact that the program looks the same, and the components or the elements of that program are the same, right? You have to figure out what you want, look at what you have, create a pathway to get there, and then put together the processes that make sure that happen. My focus is really on the operational solar portfolio. We're still solving the same problem, keeping things that want to be big, small, and looking to have compatible vegetation. So it looks different because the kind of vegetation is different. The scale of the projects is different. The customer base is a little bit different. The land that we're sited on, can be quite different. So the difference in the vegetation management does relate to the actual vegetation, but once again, it's more about the climate that we're in and the regulatory or environmental constraints that we're managing for, and the life cycle of those projects. So the vegetation management tasks vary over the span of that project's life.
On the line side, of course, right? Like, regulators and homeowners, and like you have this range of stakeholders where reliability is the crux of the discussion. On the generation side, are we talking mostly reliability? Are we talking about generation efficiency? Like, what is really the critical thing that drives how you set the program's goals and standards?
Well, it is safety and reliability, just as it is in right of way, because if you have shading on solar, that minimizes the production for it.
Right.
So we're planning for appropriate vegetation that in and of itself will require a minimum amount of management to prevent it from shading the panels.
Got it.
We're also planning, for fire prevention. That's a key element, not just out west, but everywhere. We have to manage for fuel loading and actual proximity, to the source of ignition there.
Yep.
Those are the main things that we're looking for from a true safety and reliability standpoint. But the science behind it is all about establishing the right vegetation.
Yep.
And then going deeper into, managing the soil resource. So we focus heavily on the soil resource because many of our projects are sited, well, really the lion's share of them are sited in agricultural areas. So soil is how those people make their money. And we're leasing the land from them, and the responsibility to, steward it through the life cycle, which is, may I say, a 35-year life cycle before decommissioning, and return that soil resource in at least as good as or better condition than we received it, is of vital importance just from our philosophy, but also as a way to successfully continue developing new projects. We need to deliver on that in order to be credible and have willing landowners, willing financiers, willing contractors.
On the generation side, right, and that's how I'm delineating this, is that you think that's a fair way to sort of, break apart the assets in terms of the program you're setting today versus what you were doing, let's say, in T&D? Or is this...
Yeah, I think it's about interference, right? It's always about interference with the operations. So rights of way, you don't want to interfere with, the continued safe transmission or distribution. And generation, it's the same. You don't want to interrupt generation. So I think that's how I think of it.
I think the question, where my question was going, was more other asset owners and players in the merchant market or utility space that, when you look at a lot of the utilities that we see, a lot of the dollars sit on the T&D side or power delivery side. We don't often hear about, established programs on, I'm going to say, the generation side, right? I like the way you've described it. Interference is interference. But do you think your organization, your company is one of the first to be kind of really driving that, or where's the life cycle on this side of the fence? Yeah.
Okay. So without a doubt, our company is leading the pack on, creating a dedicated team. I think there are likely other developers who have a vegetation approach built, but as far as the size of our team, the credibility, the science-based approach that we're taking, and the comprehensive nature of our program, that is unique and sets us apart. So whether it's because it's Invenergy's approach or we're doing more generation than T&D, I think that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
So
okay.
we like to, draw attention to the science-based approach and that we're solving for problems and leading the industry really in how to get that done and do it responsibly and effectively, because you can't really gold plate your program in generation any more than you can do that in right away.
Yep. No, very fair.
And are you doing, is the VM, you're offering that beyond just your own company, right? Don't you have relationships?
We are. Yeah. You caught up on that correctly. So it started off as how do we establish vegetation in the projects that we're building, because through that construction process, it's really important to establish the vegetation for the operational phase, but to comply with your stormwater pollution prevention plan. Vegetation and stabilization there is key. So the whole program as it stands today really grew out of that early need to have a plan in permitting. There's always a requirement to demonstrate that you have a long-term strategy. The first step in our comprehensive program was putting together that vegetation and soil management plan, which allowed the permitting agencies, the local regulators, and even the landowners to see that we had a handle on how to do this, and we were, appropriately prioritizing resource management. And that then could be translated into an actual strategy for implementation during construction. So by creating, a strong foundation that included soil sampling, topsoil salvage, a site-specific vegetation assemblage or seed mix, we were able to demonstrate that we're going to care for the site during construction. We're going to protect that soil resource. We're going to be compliant with the SWIP, and that into operations, we've established vegetation that is going to be appropriate. The analogous term over in right of way is a compatible plant. So what I learned when I switched over to the generation side was that we're using the term a desirable plant, right? And desirable is defined as something that is suitable to the site. It's compatible with the height and generation of the project. And it's a sustainable community in and of itself. So we reduce the number of inputs that we're using to keep that community stable.
Depending on where you're doing a project, let's just say you've got projects across multiple states, different countries, as you mentioned. like the element that you're talking about is a cost, right? There's a cost to being thoughtful. There's a cost to being, it's O&M costs. And depending on where you go and how the project financing is, and the things that the tolerance that your investors or whoever, is dealing with, like, does the math ever change, or is this something that is included consistently across the board, no matter where the project is? This line item is fixed on some percentage of the overall project costs?
Yeah, I mean, it's always there. I think our program aims to always drive toward reduced costs. I worked a few years back with the UAA on the net present value calculator. It's a very similar strategy, right? Early investments in the quality of the vegetation establishment will pay off in the long-term costs. So the line item is always there, and it ends up being a decision made by the owner where they want to make that investment, right up
Right.
front or the O&M period of the project.
And I guess that's my question. I'm like, because this is based on who the owner is, like, do you get a lot of variability in that line item, or is it generally pretty consistent?
What I'm learning is there's a very widespread and good understanding of what the optimal vegetation community is. Where there's still room for improvement is in executing on that establishment, because the plan to establish that community that will be delivering, the objectives of the project, whatever they may be, one of which is always lowest possible O&M costs. The establishment of that is a lot trickier than we might think. And many owners believe that because they wrote the plan, that's what actually happened. And without sort of midstream processes like monitoring to, measure what's actually out there and then course correct when things aren't going the way you want, and without a real close engagement with the implementation contractors, there's no verification that during those really key inputs, the right seeding time, heading off noxious and invasive weeds when they start to dominate the site, keeping your maintenance regime timed and sequenced to prevent the undesirables and foster, the dominance of those desirables. So the implementation part is what the program itself solves. Having a plan is good. Getting to the end game of the right vegetation and the most responsible way of managing it at the lowest cost, that requires a lot of processes in between.
Okay. No,
So
that's fair.
Tish mentioned your footprint, multiple states, but I'm guessing your footprint presents real challenges because, most traditional utilities, I think about thousands of miles of continuous or interconnected rights of way. That doesn't sound like your system.
Right. It's distributed generation is my reality now. And it makes it, of course, fascinating and interesting just in the ecosystems that we are operating in and, the different climates, literally, and political climates and landowner climates. But our footprint now, and again, I'm focusing on solar. We've got about 150 projects that our team is managing through development, construction, and operations. And therefore, we have a team, that is also distributed around the country and has areas that they specialize in to ensure that, they have the right expertise. But we dovetail that expertise with just acknowledging the challenge of these different areas. We have consultants who specialize in certain areas of the country. We have very often the service providers that we end up selecting are also very local. And, that has a lot of benefits, not only to the local economy, but we gain a lot from their just firsthand knowledge of those areas. So when I'm putting together an annual plan for a project that's located in one area, that I might not be familiar with. First, I get to check in, with our in-house subject matter experts who know a lot about that area. I get to check in with the environmental compliance lead and find out what they know about the constraints from that area. But then the real work of putting together that plan is done in close cooperation with the site manager, who's usually a person who's lived there their whole life, the service provider, who very often has a really deep understanding of the vegetation and the management techniques that work, and they bring great suggestions. So I always go into the planning process with an idea that, I am not the smartest person in the room. There are going to be at least two other people there that can contribute information that's going to adjust my original going in plan. So again, that makes it interesting. It makes it more certain that we'll come out with the best actual plan and one that's going to deliver the results we're looking for.
You mentioned earlier your background is ecology, right?
Forest ecology, but
Forest
also
ecology.
I have a French degree.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting. Forest ecology, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, that's not typically the background of somebody that would run a UVM program, correct?
Well, Amy did.
No, I know.
So
Well, that's
probably not the most common degree.
that's where
by
I'm
any
going with
means.
this. So Amy, make the case for me or for us as to why, future generations that are coming up and want to run these programs should have a background in forest ecology. Like, what about that has helped you have a more unique lens in what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, I'll actually go all the way back to
The French
my
degree?
little joke that I started with a French degree, right? How in the world did I get a master's in forestry without an undergraduate in forestry? And the
I
answer
didn't know
to
that.
that, Tej, is that even back then, a few years ago, they knew that people in the science field needed to have liberal arts skills. You need to have communication skills. You
100%.
need to have, the softer skills. You need to be able to kind of lift your view out of,
We call
literally
it
what's right
bedside
in
manner.
front of you.
Yes.
Look onto the landscape. So the only reason I have a forest ecology degree is that need was recognized, a long time ago. But then, because of that skill set and combining it with the science, a person who's coming into UVM is going to be more successful when they understand that it's not about the program, it's about the people. People benefit from a bigger picture. Ecology is all about the interaction of plants in their environment. Energy and the rights of way, the context for that are people and the communities. And so when you bring that sort of holistic, multidisciplinary approach to being a vegetation program manager, you have a step ahead just in success, as well as your ability to, feel fulfilled by your job. I think you're able to talk to all the different audiences. I always felt that was an advantage for me as well. Having done field work, you want to be able to relate to what it really means to stand out in the right of way for 10 hours, getting bitten by bugs and,
Yeah.
sweating gallons every day. You need to be able to walk the talk. So
Yeah.
as an ecologist, you can kind of span all of the different disciplines that come to bear,
Yeah.
and make the case. You asked me to make the case to you,
Yeah.
the right-of-way manager has to make the case to landowners.
Yeah,
You have to make the
100%.
case to regulators. You have to
100%.
make the case to your senior management, You have to talk and be able to come up with different ways of describing things depending on the learning style of the people that you're with.
Yeah, when we started in the 80s, everybody was a forester. But
Yeah.
Right.
today, the good programs, you go in and you just see these diverse backgrounds make up a team. And so
Right.
much more successful.
Yeah, you need to be responsive to what's in front of you and not just, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. Well, you need to be able to look at what are we trying to solve for here and what's the actual solution, not just the same old, same old.
I agree with everything you said, right? And I think that can be applied to multiple industries. And, I believe that liberal arts approach is very important. The bedside manner that gets developed, especially in whether it's client facing, investor facing, homeowner facing type businesses. And, one of the key objectives that we had when we were building our companies, in this space, in the utility services spaces, was identifying talent in the market that could not only do and understand the work and understand how to think about risk, but had the ability to articulate things in a thoughtful way, adjusting for the audience. And what we found is that's not a big number. So, and so one thing about this podcast that I've really enjoyed as somebody who does not come from the industry is chatting with, people like yourself and your contemporaries, and certainly Phil's contemporaries, since he's like, again, Phil hates to say this, but tree god. And just being able to hear people articulate, about the industry and the different perspectives, it's just helpful because it's complex. It's actually you said something earlier, which actually no one's really said, is like, you're like, well, it's not rocket science, and you're right. It's not rocket science, but it's also, there's an art and a science to this thing. Because you can look at it like, I've talked to multiple people and their view of the same situation, we're all looking at the same thing and they're like, well, da, 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 and this guy's like, da, 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 and they're both hyper qualified, but their perspectives on what they're looking at from a risk perspective and an approach and an execution strategy is so different. And I'm like, what? Like, how can that be? So,
yeah, you think about putting together a puzzle, and there's always this, I know what it's going to look like at the end because there's a picture on the box.
Mm-hmm.
And, you lay all the pieces out and you think, well, I'm going to put it together this way. And you proceed in that fashion. And somebody else would come sit down at the table and they would end up, building the right corner, and you started in the left corner. And,
right.
You think all of these pieces must belong together. And as you complete the project, you find out that you were totally wrong about that. So it is endlessly fascinating to see how you can slice and dice things all those different ways.
Yeah.
And you're really in the environmental group, not the O&M,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Vegetation Management sits in the Environmental Compliance and Strategy group. So we're closely aligned with, that initiative. All of us are in the business of construction, the construction business unit. So that's the driver. You have to be able to create, well, I'll call it operationalize environmentalism because, people need to see that you have the ideals that, they're not just trendy, but they're also based on science, and that you can deliver on those. And then when it comes out at the end of all the work that you've done, you have a product that looks like what you predict it was going to look like, right?
Yeah.
So it's right for us to be in that environmental compliance and strategy group.
That's interesting because in some of our travels and in talking with the various programs across the country, we find sometimes that the vegetation groups are under engineering, and sometimes they're under power delivery, so there's a lot of different approaches and philosophies as to where this organization should sit. And it's interesting to hear your perspective on that.
It's important that when they're making those plans and decisions in the early stage about the vegetation program and the commitments at the project level, that we're having good conversation. Are those, achievable? Can we sustain those over 25 or 30 years? What are the downstream impacts? Getting back to our conversation earlier about cost and who's, accepting that cost. Does that go, on the capital budget, or does that go on the operational budget? Where does that belong? So there's a lot of integration that is right, but at the same time, my internal customer, right, is the asset manager, and they're in a completely different group. So I think there's never like a perfect solution where you're perfectly situated.
Yeah. You have such an interesting lens, obviously, right? Given your background, and you've kind of touched some of the traditional organizations along the way, and now you're in a different seat, doing some different things. When you look back at when you were traveling through the traditional programs, et cetera, like where do you think the industry is still very much lagging? What have they not sort of caught up on that you see? They're like, hey, they still need to kind of get there.
You're talking about the utility vegetation
traditional
management?
Electric utility, veg programs.
I will go back to that idea of invest early and often and reap the benefits later. that early investment that would have paid off so highly if it had been sustained, over decades. You kind of have to recover that. We talked about that a lot in right away, is deferred maintenance and the cost of it. And
Yeah.
so an education at the engineering level, at the development level, or the future business development level of those long-term impacts on the bottom line of those investments in a well thought out and responsible program. Just making that case and making sure that the message sticks with the projects and with the business and doesn't leave when there's a new person in that seat. Have folks with a long-term mindset.
Do you think that because I know that you're on the Stewardship Council leadership, right?
Right away stewardship.
Right away
Yes.
Stewardship Council. Do you believe that, in my words and my understanding of the council, like, there's let's say 9, maybe 10 utilities that have achieved this accreditation. It represents a certain standard. Do you think that as more utilities adopt that standard, that could be the mechanism by which long-term investment, it just gets adopted as a standard, but as part of that standard, it's, hey, this program, the math, the money, all of it kind of ties together, and that way you've kind of built a bit of a hedge against leadership changes because they're trying to always make sure that they're of that standard? Is that one way to achieve that?
I think when it's the norm, and it's not just the norm because of passionate people inside the organization,
Right.
but because there's a requirement by the public. I always like to frame things up in who's actually paying for this. Who's actually paying for it is the person who writes the check for their utility bill. And when they demand a certain standard, and that's already happening, somewhat organically with the ability to select, your source of energy. But when there's a good understanding and they're demanding that, that's what the leadership's going to respond to. And it's also where we're going to generate our future workforce, right? So they see the opportunity, they want to get in on the industry, and all of that is like this self-sustaining cycle.
We recently spent some time with Bob Allen and Sean Redding and their team at Eversource, and they very thoughtfully are developing these arboretums, right? Bob was on talking about them, and it was really impressive to see how, and they're partnering with the University of Massachusetts and Amherst, and so there's one arboretum on their campus, and it's become a discussion point that multiple stakeholders are able to see: regulators, the public, professionals, that kind of deal. When you talk about this, right? When you talk about this, like, hey, it's got to be the buy-in of more people than just a few passionate people. Is that what you're talking about? Like, are you talking about the ratepayer? Are you talking about I'm just trying to figure out, like, how does that even come to fruition? Because like people are like, hey, I want cheap power, and then they have cheap power, and then they lose power for 2 weeks after a storm. They're like, now I want reliable power, but I want it to be cheap too. And I'm like, look, this stuff costs money. So it's like,
I think the way that broad-based support comes to fruition is by sticking with the science. Going back to it's pretty well laid out, and the execution part consistently, and then the communication part. Hey, here's why your power is lower cost. Here's why your power is reliable. I do see more and more of that. And it's certainly getting back to, generation and the program that we're building around that. That's something that we're publicizing and communicating, for our customers and, again, for the public, because we site our projects on land that we lease from other people. So they have to believe in the program and see the benefits of that too.
right.
It's sort of interesting as, so many utilities have 100-year history. And, the managers out there are living with the decisions and the relationships either developed or broken in the past. So real challenge. You have so many opportunities to start. It's pretty cool. What about the regulatory environment? You're all over. You probably have more state regulation. Am I right in that?
That's true. That is true. The regulation for, at least for what I'm familiar with, which is the solar generation projects, is more at the local level. There's heavy involvement at the county level and the state level. And so, what we look for there when we're citing new projects is there a lengthy permitting process? Are there limits on the site size? Are there zoning issues that we need to address? Is there a political climate that's favorable or not favorable? And, hopefully that is bubbling up from the landowner base there. But it is different from state to state. The development team and the origination team understand and follow and track that climate. And then as far as the environmental regulation, it's very familiar, right? To right away, we want to evaluate threatened and endangered species like bats and birds and eagles and prairie chickens and prairie dogs. We need to think about the regulated lands, wetlands, publicly owned lands, and then the general mantra, right? Avoid them as much as possible. Mitigate the ones that you can't avoid or minimize. And then those end up living with the project through not only the origination stage, but all the way into the operations. So for, again, getting back to what can you live with for 50 years, and what are the downstream impacts both on the success of the project for generating energy, but also providing that at an affordable price.
Amy, are you involved heavily with your industry organizations like UAA and ISA and those guys?
Well, I remain engaged in the Right-of-Way Stewardship Council and the UAA for the Environmental Stewardship Group. And then the company in general is really involved and engaged at American Clean Power. We like a seat at the table. That's one of the advantages, of being a thought leader and starting to establish new programs, is that we're viewed as more credible. That we have resources to bring into those dialogues that lead to what are the best practices going to be. So I feel very confidently that the work that we're doing at Invenergy and our vegetation management team is influencing best practices across the industry. And we can all feel good about that because, we're starting it with science and a long-term approach.
We always end up having this conversation about, like you said, very diverse path to where you are now. People coming up in the industry, what we kind of see is a kind of a shortened labor force and some complexity there. Do you see that also? From your lens, how are you seeing some of the people coming up through the industry? Are they investing the right way in their education of the space? What is your sort of general take on the population of professionals in this space?
Yeah, well, so the specific space being solar vegetation management, I feel as though we're at a little bit of an advantage because it's clean energy. This is a topic front of mind for people who are young professionals and they're coming out with ideals. And, hands down, it's important work. It's important work whether you're still in right-of-way or traditional utility generation. And in the renewable space, the work that we're doing is it's important now, and it's very important into the future for the environment, for the communities, for business development. And, absolutely, we are benefiting from a focus on that and the young people who have an interest in that. So I think we're probably in a little bit better condition than maybe some of the more conventional utilities.
No, that's totally fair. I was kind of curious because I feel like the tag of environmental and renewable, I feel gives you a huge advantage, right? I feel like in the traditional UVM space, it's still something that a lot of people, really young people, don't really know about still, and it's really only a draw for very, very specific type of folks and with very specific types of interests. But we're always kind of curious as to the awareness of students and the young people coming up in the space because there's definitely a shortage of folks.
I think you're right, Tej, that most folks can't know that until they experience it, unless they happen to have a conversation with somebody like me.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Well, I mean, today was, again, very unique perspective, and this was a really, really fascinating chat. Thank you for making time
Thank you,
today.
Amy.
This was
Appreciate
awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
really
it's
enjoyed
been
it.
my pleasure. Looking forward to the next time.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Absolutely. Take care.
That's it for this episode of Trees and Lines, brought to you by Iapetus Holdings. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.